And now it's time for us to discuss more of these headlines and simple keywords with Adam joining us via Zoom. Good morning, Adam.
Good morning, Lena. How are you this fine morning?
I'm doing just fine this fine morning.
So am I. I'm doing fine this fine morning as well.
It's because you're fed such good food. By the way, for some of us who are trying to, be on a healthy diet, it's tough.
Yeah. I gave you a gift recently, a very small one at that.
Which I cannot eat.
Which I gave you after you told me you're trying to stay away from such snacks, and I gave you such snacks. So, I felt a bit guilty, but not that guilty.
I'll eventually get to it because we all have cheat days. But anyway, thank you very much, Adam, for joining us. And I did appreciate a tiny gift.
You're very welcome.
All right, let's jump into our keyword news portion of the day. We're going to try to clarify some of these major headlines for our listeners. And this is our first pick of the day.
Rate freeze.
So the U.S. Federal Reserve has held interest rates steady, but officials hinted that they are prepared to raise rates again this year to tame stubborn inflation. So that's saying it's not over until it's over. It very much stands. What's the latest?
Yeah, that's because inflation is quite high still, way above the Fed's 2% target range by about more than 3%. So, of course, the Fed is kind of managing expectations, saying that this is not a start of, downsizing the monetary policy, monetary tightening policy that it's been having for the past year or two. So, of course, they are kind of hinting that more rate hikes are possible. But for the moment, they are steady, and the vote on Wednesday was unanimous to keep it frozen. Now, the benchmark interest rate, therefore, remains in the range of 5 and 5.25%. Now, it's the first time since January last year, in fact, that the Fed has made no change to interest rates. But as you said, they did hint that more rate interest hikes are forecast for this year. They signaled rates could rise to as high as 5.6%. That implies that 2 additional rate hikes are probably likely this year. Now, 3 officials see rates rising closer to 6% as well. Now, the Fed Chair Jerome Powell said inflation pressures continue to run high, adding that getting it back down to the Fed's target of 2% has a long way to go. Now, the pause announced on Wednesday, Powell said that it shouldn't be called a skip. Now, what it does do, he added, is give the economy more time to adapt to prior hikes, and he also said it lets Fed officials see the consequences of the banking turmoil that roiled the financial system in the spring. Powell also said the Fed needed credible evidence that inflation is topping out and then beginning to come back down before concluding it had squeezed the economy sufficiently, noting there had been little progress in bringing core inflation down in recent months. Now, the latest Consumer Price Index report showed a deceleration in annual inflation despite persistent price pressures across many segments of the economy. The labor market has lost some momentum also, but remains very strong, encouraging consumers to keep spending as well. So it seems like continuous rate hikes, according to the Fed chair anyway, isn't doing too much damage to the economy, as some critics might be concerned about. Therefore, it sees that there is still some room for rate hikes to keep that persistent inflation down. What happens next year? That's a completely different question. But for this year, it does seem like no lower rates are going to be expected.
All right, with that, we move on to our second keyword of the day.
Damages suit.
Although it must be said the nature of this lawsuit is not aimed at claiming damages, supposedly 44.7 billion won, South Korea has filed a $35 million damage suit against North Korea for blowing up a joint liaison office just north of their border in 2020. This is certainly going to raise tensions even further on the peninsula, but as I mentioned, some lawsuits are not necessarily designed to seek that compensation, because even if North was found liable, I'm not quite sure how the South Korean government would get them to pay.
Exactly, yes. Now, the lawsuit was filed with the Seoul Central District Court, so it's interesting that it was a local court rather than going to kind of an international court, and it did mark the first time, in fact, that the South Korean government has sued North Korea. Now, South Korea had until this Friday to claim damages. That's, of course, when a 3-year statute of limitations over the incident would expire. The government said the suit is aimed at suspending the legally set time limit for a damages claim and helping recoup the government's losses from the North's acts. Now, the Unification Ministry said the violent demolition of the office by North Korea constitutes a clear violation of the law, calling it a breach of the Panmunjom Declaration adopted between Moon Jae-in, the former president, and the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. And in that declaration was included to build this liaison office. And now the ministry said the total amount of the damage covers 10.25 billion won for the liaison office and 34.45 billion won for an adjacent support facility, which was also seriously damaged by the fallout of the demolition. Now, Pyongyang did not immediately react to the actual lawsuit. If Pyongyang chooses not to respond to it, legal experts say there is a high chance the South Korean government would win the case. But even if that happens, there are currently no means to force Pyongyang to actually cough up the compensation and the money. That's why some are calling the suit more of a symbolic move. Now, in terms of $35 million rather, it's not that much for the government to suffer a loss of, basically. Right. They can certainly afford to kind of lose out on that kind of money, but the actual move itself is kind of course, sending a signal, according to experts, to North Korea. Now, if anything, inter-Korean tensions will only likely get worse. So we could see more provocations from the regime, of which there have been many recently, of course. Now, on concerns over whether the suit would be effective in making the North provide compensations, the ministry official told reporters the government will explore feasible means and that lodging the suit is a preemptive move for this girl. So, yes, money is not the objective, according to many experts in this matter, but certainly does send a signal and continues with the kind of hardline stance that the Yoon government is taking with Pyongyang.
All right, so a more symbolic move there. Let's move on to our third keyword of the day.
ICT exports drop.
So more on the country's suffering export portfolio. Korea's export of ICT products dropped for the 11th straight month due to the continued sluggish demand for locally made tech products, namely chips, might I add? Tell us the details.
Yeah, so ICT products and tech products in general are kind of a key export item for Korea. So any downward trend on those exports is certainly bad news for the Korean economy and its kind of deteriorating trade deficit. Now, Trade Ministry data shows the exports of ICT products dropped 28.5% from a year earlier to $14.45 billion in May. The ministry said ICT exports fell across nearly all product categories. For example, semiconductor exports plunged 35.7% to about $7.5 billion on the back of lower chip prices. Display panel shipments retreated 12% to about $1.6 billion. Now, mobile phone exports dipped 17.2% to $920 million. The ministry attributed the decline to continued sluggish demand, as well as a record high figure that was actually recorded in May last year. So in terms of that month, it certainly has some big shoes to fill. By nation, combined shipments to China slumped 31.6% on year to $6 billion. ICT product shipments to Vietnam, the US, and the EU all sank in double-digit percentage points as well. Imports for ICT products also shrank 11.2% over the year to $11.2 billion. That sends the trade surplus in the ICT industry to $3.25 billion. So certainly continued concerns in terms of Korea's exports and key exports at that when it comes to tech products and services.
All right, on that front, we'll leave it there for now. We move on to our fourth keyword of the day.
ITLOS.
So South Korea has produced 3 consecutive judges of the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, as we mentioned earlier, ITLOS. This could help Korea have a stronger voice in its opposition to Japan's planned release of wastewater from the Fukushima nuclear power plant. I mean, that's right on schedule to start releasing by the end of this month, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah, that's right. Now, Lee Jae-hyung was elected by ITLOS judges for the 2023 to 2032 term in a vote that was held at the UN headquarters in New York. Now, in the election, which pitted South Korea, Japan, and Iraq against each other for 2 vacancies in the Asia-Pacific regional group, Lee won 144 votes out of 164 countries that cast ballots. There were 167 that are actually present. Now, that tied him with Japan's Hidehisa Hironouchi for 2/3 majority required for election. South Korea has actually had a judge at ITLOS since its inception in 1996, so it hasn't been vacant by Korea since then. Now, the late judge Park Chun-ho served from 1996 to 2008, and the former judge Baek Jin-hyung served from 2009 to present. Now, ITLOS is located in Hamburg, Germany. It is an international tribunal that deals with disputes concerning the interpretation and application of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which forms the basis of maritime order, basically. Now, the foreign ministry here said in a press release that the election of Lee will not only raise Korea's profile in the field of maritime law, but also expand its role. It added that the government has been making multifaceted efforts to ensure the continued presence of Korean representatives at ITLOS. And it also said that the election was also a reaffirmation of the international community's sympathy and trust in the values Korea has expressed and pursued as a global pivotal nation, something we've been hearing a lot under this administration, as well as its efforts to implement them. So there has been calls still for Korea to lodge a complaint at ITLOS for Japan's planned wastewater release. It hasn't done so yet, but whether we will see that under this new judge remains to be seen.
All right. It seems that time is of the essence on that front. So in the coming weeks, perhaps we'll revisit this topic. Let's move on to our final keyword of the day.
Blinken to Beijing.
So the U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken will travel to China this weekend to try and navigate Washington's complicated, that might be an understatement, relationship with Beijing. It's been delayed months. What can we expect?
Yes, so the trip from June 16th to the 19th will be Blinken's first visit to China as Secretary of State, in fact. So U.S. officials sought to kind of lower expectations about a major breakthrough, calling the trip a chance to, resume communication that had been disrupted by months of tension. I think months is also an understatement as well. I think years is probably a better way of putting it. Now, Blinken will likely raise concerns held by the US over a number of issues involving China. Now, as you mentioned, it has been delayed. The trip was originally set for early February, but was postponed due to a Chinese spy balloon transiting the US, so another area of tension between the US and China. The State Department said that although no major breakthrough is expected, the trip will serve as a critical series of engagements the US will have with China to kind of manage their frosty relations. The department spokesperson Matthew Miller said Blinken would meet with senior officials while in Beijing. Now, the US officials did not give details about who those officials are or whether that would include a meeting with China's President Xi Jinping. Now, ahead of the trip, Blinken actually spoke with China's foreign minister by phone. He was said to have discussed the importance of maintaining open lines of communication to responsibly manage US-China relations, to avoid miscalculation and conflict. Blinken also addressed a wide range of bilateral and global issues and made clear the US would continue to use diplomatic engagements to raise areas of concern and areas of potential cooperation as well. But China's readout of the call was noticeably a bit more pointed, underscoring the deep distrust that lingers between the two nations. China's Foreign Minister Xi Kang told Blinken the US should show respect on China's core concerns, such as the Taiwan issue. So certainly a difference in temperature in terms of what they are trying to seek in this phone call and subsequent trip. But of course, we'll have to see what does come out of that trip after the weekend.
Normally, when they meet face to face, they're much more cordial in tone. But with such a big discrepancy between, I guess, what the two sides might want to discuss, we'll have to wait and see. We'll have the entire next week to delve a little bit deeper onto the topic.
Certainly.
Thank you very much, Adam. We'll see you tomorrow.
Have a great day. You're very welcome. See you tomorrow.
If you're listening to our program using the podcast service, just a reminder that we do go live Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. Korea Standard Time. So tune in and help us make the show more informative by giving us your input. See you bright and early on Good Morning Seoul.